Hi, my name's Braden. You may know me online as Coach Cadd. Today I'm again joined by Aaron Hoey, and we dived into a study based around a principle called the 3-7 method. Now, this is a really interesting one, and it caused quite a stir when it came out, so I hope you get a lot of value out of this. We're going to get right into it here. Kind of our kind of takeaways from this. Basically, your rest and your cluster pause methods can absolutely be a valid way of creating growth. But a really important takeaway is that just because it's a valid way of creating hypertrophy doesn't mean it's better, right? We do still have that gold standard of straight sets. If time allows, you're probably better off still doing straight sets. But if you do want a bit of novelty, or you want to push yourself a little bit more, or you're short on time, by all means, some of these methods can be completely valid and good ways of creating a result. So, welcome back to episode 2 of the Too Long Didn't Read Fitness podcast. I'm joined again today with my friend Aaron, once again across a lot of time zones. How are you, Aaron?
I'm not too bad, thanks, Braden.
Good. We learned last time that there's a bit of a lag, so we're going to try and give ourselves a little space to breathe, but we'll see how we go today.
Yep, all good. Excellent. So today we're going to be talking about this new study which has come out, which has caused a little bit of a stir in the fitness community. And basically what it is something which is called the 3-7 method of lifting. And the study itself was published in the European Journal of Applied Physiology. And what the study looked at was it compared two different modes of training. So the first one is this new concept called the 3-7 method, which involved finding a weight which was 70% of a 1 rep max. And what they did was they lifted it for 3 reps, set it down, rested for 15 seconds. Then they lifted it again for 4 reps, set it down, rested for 15 seconds, lifted it again for 5 reps, 15 seconds rest, 6 reps, 15 seconds rest, and then 7 reps. After that, they rested for 2 minutes, and then they performed one more set. So they did 2 total sets on that one. They compared the exercise to 8 sets of 6 repetitions with 2 minutes rest between each of those sets. And this was both for a bicep curl. And at the end of it, they found that the group that did the 3-7 method actually had an increase in 1 RM strength and increased bicep thickness. So yeah, and the results were quite substantial as well. I'm pretty sure there was a 75% increase in bicep thickness, which was measured using, I'm pretty sure it was an ultrasound method, which is one of the more accurate methods of evaluating muscle hypertrophy. So yeah, pretty cool study, which we're looking at today, Braden.
Yeah, this one was a little bit spicy. There's so many different, I guess, fads out there and different training methodologies, and everyone kind of saying that their method is the best one that's going to get you different results. But if you said, here's a new method, and this is what this study did, it said, here's a new method that can potentially give you 75% increased muscle mass over traditional strength training. Like that's massive. Like this was hard for me to believe initially.
Yeah, I agree. When I first had a look at this, I saw it like a few kind of just Instagram stories coming through, and I was just like, yeah, whatever. Someone's probably just trying to reinvent the wheel kind of thing. But after actually reading the study and having a look at it, it certainly did raise a few more, just probably like reiterated a few points and then also raised a few more questions.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's the biggest one. Is I think a lot of us that have been in the industry for a little bit longer kind of are a little bit skeptical about individual studies like this. And we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive, hopefully, into kind of the overall literature and kind of where this fits into that overall kind of idea of what actually produces muscle. Just to quickly touch on it now, I don't think it's new, but I hadn't come across the 3-7 before. That seems like a bizarre little like rest pause sets and cluster training is definitely not new. But have you come across this specific 3-7 method before?
No, I actually haven't. When I first saw 3-7 method, my first thought was actually like the whole 2-5 method, which is more of a like an intermittent calorie restriction diet, which can be used to get people to lose weight. So when I saw the 3-7, that's the first thing that I thought of, but I haven't actually seen like a training intervention, which was called that before.
So I did a little bit like the first thing that came to my head is there's a few guys. I can't remember his name, but he works with a lot of like Mr. Olympia competitors, and it's like FTS7, like stretching for 7 seconds. Do you remember what his name is?
Yeah, Hanny Rambod. Hanny Rambod coaches
Yep.
Jeremy Boondia, Phil Heath, The Rock, that new guy, on Andre Rieu, I think his name is. He's also like a really young up and coming men's physique athlete. Yeah,
I
so he's
believe
definitely coined that method.
Andre Rieu is a professional violin player.
I can't pronounce his name. It looks very similar. I'll send you it after.
I'll be very impressed if Andre Rieu. I think I'm getting the name right because I think my grandma loves him. So I'll be very impressed. You're showing us that not only are you a bodybuilder, you're an absolute man of culture. But if he's getting in on the FTS7 and stepping up to the Olympia stage soon, I'll be very impressed.
That's fair enough.
So
I'll try to learn how to pronounce his name correctly for next time.
Good. If not, I expect a meme about where you've photoshopped Andre Rieu's head onto the bodybuilder, onto Jeremy Buendia's body. That would be good. Yeah. So look, I mean, one of the things about, the FTS7 and those kinds of methods is I haven't actually looked into studies on that specifically, but it's one of those things about, these training methods, but then they're applied to guys who are at the top of their game, genetic freaks, and on a lot of additional supplements. So you're like, okay, well, is the training method actually magic, or is it just the fact that you're providing a stimulus to these guys that are geared off their heads anyway? So it's really interesting to see this study, bring it back to this one specifically. I think 3-7's been around for a while, actually, as a I saw it mentioned in some powerlifting circles, and maybe we can talk a little bit about that. I could be wrong, but I thought it potentially had some of its origins in strength training, which I think you might have some thoughts on, but we should probably come back to that a little bit further down the track. To talk back about this one specifically, so yeah, really interesting to see. Now, some things to note with it, this study was done specifically on elbow flexors, so the biceps. Can you talk a little bit about, maybe the selection of reps and sets that they chose for the control versus the 3-7? Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. So when we look at rep ranges for varying exercises, we tend to see in the gym that certain exercises seem to bias themselves towards certain rep ranges a little bit more effectively compared to other exercises. So a good example might be, let's say, a hack squat, for example. If I told you, Brandon, that you had to do a set of 20 to 30 reps on a hack squat, you would probably be quite disgusted, because that's probably an exercise which is going to just be quite a lot more neurally demanding, a lot more like overall just like taxing on the upper, the lower body and like the lungs, and especially if you're going to be doing those higher reps. So it's probably going to bias itself more so towards those lower rep ranges, maybe like anywhere between like the 5 to 10 rep range. Whereas something like it's really small, like a delt, a bicep, they're probably going to bias themselves a little bit more towards higher rep ranges. And another reason why we might want to do that is because if we use too high a load, that actually might compromise our technique for that smaller muscle group. And then we're not actually effectively loading that muscle to the degree that we would want to load that muscle in order to be able to like max it out, take it close to mechanical failure, and deliver a really, really good hypertrophic stimulus. So I found it really interesting in this study how the rep range that they used to compare the 3-7 method to, they chose an 8x6, so 8 sets of 6 reps for a bicep curl, which personally I've never programmed a bicep curl for any of my clients under 8 reps. And even 8 reps is like, that's very rare. Like usually I'm probably working up like 10 plus reps for most of my bicep, tricep, and shoulder work for clients. So yeah, definitely very interesting like loading scheme that they chose to compare the 3-7 to. My guess is that it was simply so that they could equate volume a little bit more easily. So the 8x6 group did 48 total repetitions, whereas the 3-7 group did 50 repetitions once you take into the account that there was 25 repetitions per set for 2 sets. So I'm guessing that's probably why they went with the 8-6, even though it's probably not the most effective loading range, especially for a bicep muscle.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, just to recap, and you touched on this, but I want to make it really clear for anyone listening what the actual 3-7 is. So, like Aaron said, you pick a weight, and I think it's 70% of 1 rep max.
70%. Yep.
And so then you're going to do 3 reps with that. You're then going to put the weight down, rest for 15 seconds, do 4 reps. Put the weight down, rest for 15 seconds, do 5 reps until you've done 7. Now, the group that did that, they did that twice. So they did 2 sets of that with a pretty substantial rest between. Okay, so then you've got on the other end of the spectrum, you've got the control group who did 8 sets of 6 reps. I think most people listening to this will know what that means, with also a similar weight, so 70% of your 1 rep max. And like Aaron was talking about there, like it's really important to make sure that when you're looking at a study like this, that volume is equated. So one of the things we're going to talk about in a second is the fact that volume seems to be one of the key drivers of muscle hypertrophy. I think Aaron will agree with that. It seems to play this really crucial role. So if you have 2 of these studies and you're comparing different methods, but they're not performing roughly the same volume, there's no point even doing the study, right? Because then you're just, comparing apples and oranges, right? There's no point. So that's the only kind of justification. I know a lot of people, Jackson Pierce did a really good write up on this, and he's kind of got a program built around this kind of concept, which I've seen some of his training clips and looks absolutely brutal. I've actually got the program, but I don't have access to a gym to give it a crack yet. But the thing about this is that, yeah, it's if you're comparing, yes, you're equating volume, so 48 reps in one and 50 in the other, but that there's a lot more to it, right? To do a 6 rep max, or like to do 6 heavy reps of biceps, is hard. And like Aaron talked about as well, if you look at the literature, there's a big rep range that people can do and still get growth, anywhere from 6 plus to up to 30 to 40 reps, even potentially plus. You can still stimulate a lot of growth and a lot of hypertrophy through the rep ranges, but that's from a theoretical standpoint, right? If we then take that knowledge and apply it to an actual gym setting, there are some exercises that are physiologically just going to be hard to do for either higher reps or low reps. Or more realistically, like Aaron said, if you give it to a client, they're just fucking straight out not going to do it, right? Like if you give someone a 25 rep set on a hack squat, they're just not going to do it. Or they're probably just not going to get the same kind of stimulus out of it. Same with like squats are a little bit to a same degree. Like, yes, you can do high rep squats, but at some point you're probably the risk outweighs the reward. Same with, deadlifts. And it seems like that continuum kind of shifts the other way for isolation exercises, right? Doing a 6 rep max. This is kind of like doing a 6 rep max on the leg extension. Like you can do it, and yes, you probably will stimulate some growth, but realistically, it's not going to feel great. It's probably not going to get a super good pump. Your joints probably aren't going to love it, and there's more enjoyable ways to train. So this is moving away from the literature, and one of the things we want to do in this podcast is kind of talk about the science, but then talk about the practical as well. So I'm just going to kick it to you, Aaron. Do you kind of have any thoughts just to throw out around that?
Now, from the practical perspective, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think that a few other things which we might just look at through the study. So we talked about volume and how important the volume is, that we've got volume equated across different methods so that we are comparing apples to oranges. And some of you might know or may not know that volume can actually be quantified in different ways, and different studies may actually quantify volume a little bit differently. So volume can be quantified as tonnage, which means like the total amount, like the weight lifted across the amount of reps and sets. And like, so rep, set, load, and that would be your tonnage. Or sometimes they could quantify it as hard working sets. So how many sets did we take close to a certain intensity? And that typically is how volume is communicated in most of the fitness circles, just because it's a really, really effective way to measure how much training someone did. So I might say to Braden, in my arm volume at the moment, I'm doing 18 sets a week of bicep curls. And Braden knows that that's not 5 sets of fluffing around and 13 hard sets. He knows that that's 13 hard sets, because in order to quantify a set towards like your weekly volume total, it has to meet a minimum intensity threshold of basically within 4 reps of failure. So then moving on to intensity. So what is intensity? Intensity is effectively how hard we're lifting or how hard we're working. So volume's how much work we do, and intensity is how hard we perform that work. And most people will quantify their intensity through a method known as RPE or RIR, like the reps in reserve scheme, which basically tries to objectively quantify how many reps we are away from failure. So if I went to absolute failure, I would go work to an RPE 10, which is 0 reps in reserve, because RPE and RIR are inversely proportionate to each other. If I went to an RPE 8, that would be 2 reps in reserve. And we know that basically we have to meet a minimum intensity threshold of about 6 RPE or 4 reps in reserve in order to make sure that we're getting the benefits of that muscle stimulation from those sets. So that's actually something which we could actually look at in this study, and we could compare those 2 methods. Like the volume was equated, but maybe the intensity wasn't equated, and maybe that was one of the reasons why we saw more muscle hypertrophy in the 3-7 group.
Yeah, absolutely. Have you tried the 3-7 since this study came out?
I haven't, but I am tempted to program it for a few clients in the not too distant future. I do use MyoReps for a lot of my clients. So MyoReps, for those who aren't aware, is very similar. It is a rest pause set where I might give them 4 sets total, and their first set is going to be taken to an RPE 9, so with 1 rep in reserve. Then they rest for 15 seconds, perform another set to an RPE 9, regardless of how many reps that is. Rest, and then rest again, and you perform as many sets as is prescribed. So if I prescribe 4 sets, you'll do 4 sets with 15 seconds rest between each one. And due to the accumulating fatigue, you typically see performance decrease across those 4 sets. I probably would give this a go, but I'm currently not in control of my program at the moment. So I guess I'll just keep ticking along, being a good athlete, and keep following the plan.
Correct. That's well documented. I won't tell your coach that what conversations we actually have about your training behind off camera. No, of course, Aaron, following the plan 100% at all times. Yeah, so essentially, like, this is really interesting because I'm a big fan of MyoReps, right? And I've been giving them to myself and clients for a long time. But essentially, a myo set is almost the opposite of a 3-7. It's almost a 7-3. Not exactly, but you've got your harder sets at the start, and then you've got you're taking your short break and then getting realistically less reps, taking a rest, getting a few more reps. And so it's interesting to see that these methods, all kind of have their merit, and kind of assess what consistencies across them are creating muscle growth, right? So we know that straight sets where you do a set of 10 or 12, rest, do a second set of 10 or 12, rest, do a third set of 10 or 12. We know that is kind of the gold standard of training, of creating hypertrophy, right? That's kind of always going to be always going to be that kind of god tier method. And that's one of the reasons why we're so skeptical when a new study like this comes out, because in order for it to be valid, it's kind of got to usurp this age old god tier principle that keeps happening, right? But we also do know that there are a lot of other methods that can produce hypertrophy, and some of that is volume, some of that is kind of intensity. So do you want to talk a little bit, Aaron, just on what those principles are? So if we talk about like mechanical tension, we talk about metabolic stress as kind of our main two. Let's go a little bit into what actually creates change in the muscle, what creates growth in the muscle.
Sure. So yeah, so if we're looking at like underlying like physiological mechanisms which induce muscle growth, there's kind of three which are heralded. However, like the exact relationship between all three is a little bit unclear. So we've got like a metabolic stress, your muscle damage, and your mechanical tension. However, mechanical tension seems to be like the primary driver, and metabolic stress and muscle damage are more so byproducts of that mechanical tension accumulation. So basically at the like if we're like looking at a muscle cell through a microscope, we're going to have almost like these little fingers called actin and myosin. And what they do is they bind together and they contract and basically pull themselves and shorten, and that leads to like a muscle contracting and shortening. And that degree of tension which is placed on those little protein filaments as they combine, that's what we determine to be mechanical tension, like the amount of tension experienced by that muscle cell. Basically, when that muscle cell, that binding happens, we have something occur called mechanotransduction, which is when the mechanical signal from the tension is actually turned into a chemical signal. That chemical signal then activates a cascade of metabolic stress, and the end product of that is the activation of mTOR, which is mammalian target of rapamycin complex 1, mTORC1, and that's just a fancy name for the big button which induces muscle hypertrophy and makes muscles grow. So if we're looking at like muscle hypertrophy from a cellular level, things can be very, very complicated, because like we can know exactly how to kind of trigger muscle hypertrophy, but then taking that backwards and writing that into a program can sometimes get a little bit murky. And I've seen many a coach go in and start reading all these, like they'll start reading a study and they'll be like, oh, like metabolic stress causes mTORC activation, therefore we must chase metabolic stress in our programming. And then they write a programming which theoretically sounds pretty good, but practically just does not work and just isn't conducive to muscle hypertrophy. So yeah, those kind of metabolic pathways is certainly important to know, and like having a conceptual understanding is nice, but more so how you can like make those practical is a lot more useful for strength coaches.
Yeah, and I'm actually I'm digging through Schoenfeld's updated book at the moment, and that was it's a really good deep dive into, it's a really interesting concept, the fact of like the question of, okay, how does me lifting something actually how does that then get transferred into a chemical release in the body? And it's for me, it's especially been kind of a deep dive back into the, almost this quantum physics, like nothing in the world exists. It's not real. It's just space between atoms. And it's like this real matrix kind of simulation thing. Cause you're like, why does me picking up a dumbbell, why is me doing anything? It's literally just electronic signals and chemicals. And you're like, this shouldn't make sense, right? But coming back to, that example, like you said, of where does the theory and the practical come together? The other look that we see a lot in the fitness industry is that concept, that kind of trying to reverse engineer from vague theoretical concepts, I think gets a lot of people in nutrition. And it gets a huge amount of action in, I mean, I say nutrition, but in like lifestyle and wellness coaching, where people are like, in extreme diets, where it's like insulin gets blamed for everything, right? But we know mechanistically what insulin does, but we also know that low carb diets that produce less insulin don't necessarily produce less, or that don't result in greater rates of fat loss, right? So insulin doesn't cause fat loss. We know what's happening in the body, but the real world application is not necessarily the same. It's the same thing whenever people go, okay, do this, this, and this because it spikes your testosterone. And you're like, okay, that's great, but we actually don't see that increased small muscle mass, right? Aside from, steroids, where we're talking on a whole nother playing field, you're like, okay, just because something releases growth hormone now, that doesn't increase. We don't see that increased muscle mass long term. Just because something increases testosterone now, we don't see this benefit. And so, especially when training, just because something stimulates mTOR or something, activates your AMPK pathway or whatever these terms that people throw around, we need to be able to then actually take that step back and go, okay, well, is that going to practically produce results, right? So in the gym, what produces mechanical tension? Like if someone says, okay, I want to write a program that focuses on mechanical tension, and then I want to write a program that focuses on metabolic stress. We're going to look at those as kind of our two driving factors for hypertrophy. Can you just kind of put that into a bit more of a practical context?
Sure. So the important thing that we're looking at also, it's like we've got our mechanical tension now and our metabolic stress. That's perfectly fine. They are important. But from a practical perspective, it's probably a little bit better to look at volume and intensity and make sure that, one, we're doing sufficient volume, so not too much volume, but not too little volume, and then sufficient intensity. So remember that we have to be lifting within those 4 odd reps of failure. Otherwise, we're probably not getting the most optimal stimulus. So in order to get adequate mechanical tension, we're probably going to be looking at slightly heavier loads, loading up the muscle through its like full range of motion, getting like a good solid contraction. And then, so that's gonna like enable us to get adequate mechanical tension. And then for every repetition we are increasing the muscle's exposure to tension. So the duration which is under tension. If you do that for, let's say 6 to 12 reps, for example, and you get close to failure, it's like that you've satisfied the mechanical tension component and that we've pushed close to failure. Beautiful. That's awesome. That's going to be a stimulating set. You do enough stimulating sets to meet your volume requirements. Bingo, you're probably going to have some hypertrophy. From a metabolic stress standpoint, you still have to get close to mechanical failure. So unless you're an absolute beginner, you're still going to have to get close to failure, even with those more metabolically stressful sets, in order to induce a large enough stimulus that you're actually going to get some hypertrophy. And that's actually one of the biggest critiques of more metabolic training, is the higher the reps get, the more painful and uncomfortable it gets, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're getting close to mechanical failure. So if I gave Braden a 30, I told him to do as many reps as he can of bicep curls with his 30 rep max, he's probably going to be feeling very, very uncomfortable by rep 24, 25, but he's still 5-6 reps away from failure, which means that if he wants to get that actual, like a really, really good solid stimulus out of that set, he's going to have to push that a little bit further. So like the metabolic stress is certainly going to be you're going to, like, from a practical perspective, it's a little bit more on the metabolic stressful side of the equation when like there's a lot more pump, there's a lot of blood flow, higher reps, the duration of the set takes longer. And yeah, one of the downsides is your ability to gauge intensity decreases as the reps increase.
100%. And I think that is something that I try and kind of, I guess, cultivate in my clients as well, that knowledge and I guess that assessment between, okay, where is my objective failure point? And this is kind of, the RIR versus the RPE kind of systems, but well, where is my objective failure point and where is my subjective failure point? Because so often you can think that you're training pretty hard and then you watch a recording of it back or something and you're like, shit, I had 6 more reps in the tank. Like I wasn't even slowing down. And often, especially when you're working with mechanical tension, you get that quote unquote lactic acid buildup, you get that burn, you get that genuine uncomfortable feeling. And a lot of people when they go to the gym they're like, oh, just push through the burn, like the pump. You don't realize that that's something that you get better at. Like when you first go to the gym, that feels like poison in your body, right? That is burning, that is battery acid inside your arms. Like it's not as simple as that's your body's like signal that you're doing something wrong to a degree. Like it takes a little bit of time for your body to actually get better at processing that. And so that's what I tell my clients as well, is like that burning feeling, while it's kind of a good thing in trying to produce a result in the body, also understand that it is going to be uncomfortable. It's designed to be uncomfortable. That's not a problem, but it will take some time to get used to, right? And I think that's where, like you were saying, a lot of these training programs built around emphasizing mechanical tension fall down. If you go on any YouTube influencer channel, they'll have some exercise where you do 100 or 30, or 30 seconds or a minute of like jumping around and stuff. And those workouts all feel very, very hard. They produce a lot of lactic acid and they burn and they're painful. But we're also not going to see hypertrophy in that, because we're not actually pushing close to failure. If I said do body weight squats for as long as you can, you would definitely stop because you're tired, not because you physically can't do another rep, right? And so that's kind of our difference. And I think, correct me if I'm kind of butchering this as a general concept, Aaron, but I think that's kind of, I guess, the most practical take home for people in the difference between mechanical tension and metabolic stress is, are you actually pushing close to your objective failure point? That's our assessment of of kind of training with mechanical tension, or are you stimulating that pump and the burn? That's generally going to be more of a sign of metabolic stress. Does that kind of recap? I think I think a few of the concepts. Anything I've missed there?
Yeah, I think it's just probably important to reiterate that they're not completely separate. Like there's going to be a degree of overlap between them, which is kind of what makes this like entire area of study so complex. You cannot really, you cannot from a practical standpoint look like set a client up. It's like, okay, you're in the mechanical tension group and you're in the metabolic stress group. Let's compare the two, because that doesn't work, because metabolic stress will happen as a byproduct of mechanical tension. So as those muscle cells basically create force, that is going to create those metabolic waste products. Like they are almost like, imagine like when you run your car and you run your car and then you got basically waste products coming out the exhaust pipe. That's kind of what's happening in the muscle cell. Like the muscles are firing and everything's moving, and then you've got these waste products which are being they're just kind of floating around as a byproduct of that tension production. And the whole theory about the metabolic stress is, by creating some of those metabolites, that is going to have a slightly anabolic effect, and that's going to create stress on the muscle cell, and the muscle cell is going to respond to that stress by adapting to it, becoming bigger and stronger. So just probably important for listeners to understand that they're not two completely different physiological systems. Like that, there's a degree of overlap between the two.
Yeah, 100%. I think that also, if anyone's involved in the bodybuilding or around the bodybuilding space in social media, they will come up against this dichotomy where you get all these people talking about intensity or volume. And again, it's this dumb conversation that is perpetrated or pushed essentially on social media, because it's a false dichotomy. Like you cannot have one without the other. Yes, there is an important conversation to have about which one is more beneficial. But as soon as you get people talking in absolutes, like this one is more important than the other, it's just a conversation that isn't really worth having, right? It's like, oh, do you squat or you deadlift? And well, the answer is, you could probably do both, or you could do either. There's a lot of ways to skin a cat. So to circle back to that was a really we went on what seems like a little bit of a tangent there, but these are some really fundamental concepts to understand what's actually happening when we create muscle, right? So hopefully you guys, anyone listening to this, has got some value from that. I want to bring it back to this study specifically again. So talking about those two ends of the extreme, essentially we've got the 3-7 method at one end, and we've got the 8x6 method at the other. Where do you think, so we've seen in this study basically that the 3-7 has been demonstrated to be better than the 8x6, and it's actually worth noting that That's actually like the author's conclusion on this paper is that the 3-7 method creates greater growth in the biceps than the 8x6. Now, that is very important because when most people read a study like this, that's not going to be their takeaway. Their takeaway will be the 3-7 method worked better. If I don't do that, I'm missing out. That's a more optimal way of training, right? But we know that that's not what the authors said, right? They didn't say this is the new gold standard of training. They said that this works better than the 8x6, which is some example that we picked, right? So question for you, Aaron, then is, what are some drawbacks of this study? Let's start there. What are some drawbacks of this study?
Sure. So a few drawbacks. One, in order to really kind of deduce how good the 3x7 is, it would be a lot better if you were comparing it to some kind of training method or like loading scheme, which is more typically seen in a hypertrophy program. Like as we kind of spoke about at the start, like no one like programs 8x6 for biceps, but like you could probably program 4 sets of 12, which will get you 48 reps, like, or like 4 sets of approximately like 10 to 14, which will get you around the 48 reps, which means that volume is more or less equated, and that would have been like a better loading scheme in regards to repetitions. So that's probably one drawback. Like the loading scheme which they compared against it's almost like a straw man argument. It's like if you're going to like have a good argument, you want it going up against like a good you want to make sure that your strong argument is going up against another strong argument. You don't want like your kind of thing that you're evaluating going up against something which is easily going to be beaten, because it's not a true test of the validity of what you're trying to test. So yeah, I definitely would have liked that. The other thing to recognize, and this is like going to be most studies which are looking at like mechanisms of muscle hypertrophy, but they're usually going to be done in like a very specific muscle group, like a bicep or like a quadricep. It wasn't looking at overall muscle hypertrophy, and a lot of people aren't going into the gym simply to perform a bicep curl. Like it's probably going to be like one thing which they've got in a program alongside other things. So yeah, if you're looking at that, you certainly can't conclude from the study, yep, sweet, all of my exercises are now going to be 3-7 method. That's just not going to be like a good takeaway.
Yeah, for sure. And I think like, we can appreciate from again, this is one of the problems with the quote unquote evidence-based culture that exercise is kind of traveling, where it's like you can't, in a lot of cases now, it's like you can't do anything unless you've got a study that directly shows what you're doing. Or a lot of people are looking for that, where if you want to make a statement about something, unless you can document it with an exact study, it kind of gets dismissed, right? Because now people are searching PubMed for the answers they want instead of Google or Ask or Reddit like it used to be, right? So one thing that is worth 100% talking about that from this study is like Aaron said, even though this has shown promise, right? It's a really exciting study and it's a really cool concept. To me, my takeaway from it was not, the 3-7 method is the gold standard. It's, okay, hang on, the 3-7 method might actually have some validity, and it probably is more important for me. It raises an interesting question about the role of metabolic stress in training, because the 3-7 method is I would say is quite a a metabolically stress focused protocol, compared to the 8x6, which is very much a mechanical tension based protocol. And it kind of is a bit of a nod to the concept of, hey, mechanical tension is very important, but let's not sleep on the capacity that the metabolic stress and the burn and the pump actually has to potentially facilitate muscle growth. Would you kind of agree with that?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I'd also take away that training intensity is often probably one of the areas where I see most of my clients just not utilizing to the extent which they could. So like a lot of people like that, people don't want to train hard because training hard is uncomfortable and training hard sucks. And even in this study, like you can just look at the two protocols and it's like which one of these would like be more painful? The 3x7, like 3-7 for sure. It would definitely be more uncomfortable, but you would probably train with a greater intensity. You would probably train harder. I dare say on some of those 8x6, like that's not even a flexible loading range with the 8x6. It's just 8 sets of 6. So on that first set, if you get 6 reps and you could have got 4 or 5 more, it's like, nah, you're done that set. And it's like, oh, sweet. Okay, I'll rest up. But that's not necessarily taking that set close to failure. And if you're quite fit and like you can recover adequately within those 2 minutes, you might go 8 sets and not actually get close to mechanical failure on any of those sets, which means it's probably going to be a relatively poor stimulus. So if anything, like the 3-7 really reiterates that like training hard is going to work. So if you can find exercise modalities and different methods to ensure that you are training hard and you are getting close to relative failure, like a high relative intensity, close to mechanical failure, that's probably going to be in your best interests if your goals are growing muscle.
I actually like still in lockdown over here in Denmark, so I got some blood flow restriction bands to put around my upper arm. It's a concept. We'll probably do a study on blood flow training at some point, but I was using that for my push-ups, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the main purpose being, instead of me having to do 3 or 4 sets of between 15 and 30 push-ups to get a decent stimulus. That was a flex for anyone listening at home. It's more like 7, but no. So instead of me having to do between 15 and 30 reps to get a pump, I was able to use blood flow, the restriction bands, and they would get pretty hard anywhere north of 10. So between 10 and 20 was like a pretty good working set. I actually tried the 3-7 method, and because I couldn't load up more, or I couldn't use a heavier weight, I started my reps at 7. So I did 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 was my plan. After about 3 weeks, after the first session, I decided not to try and do it with the blood flow restriction because it was way too hard. And then I did it body weight, and I think it took me about 3 or 4 weeks to make it past 10. So I would go 7, 8, 9, and then I was toast. Like, this is a hard method, and that fatigue accumulates quickly, especially, doing 7, 8, and 9 instead of doing 3, 4, 5. But it gets very spicy very, very quickly. And that's the thing. I think one of the things to practically assess when looking at a bodybuilding study like this is, you said as well, Aaron, what's the practical application of this? Like, when you're actually doing it, what's the mindset of the trainees going to be like? If they're not bodybuilders, they probably have never trained hard before anyway. And then if you start putting them through like 8x6 is something, especially for biceps, like you've got you've done powerlifting comps as well as I have. Like, if you're doing actually balls to the wall 6 reps, that's a different mental space you've got to get yourself into, right? You don't just stroll in and give it your best. So it is kind of hard to take a study like this too much to its word, because there are a lot of factors that kind of don't show up on the study design, I guess, or the study write-up.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree 100% with everything you just said there.
Brilliant. Good. I'll take that as me being on the right page then. Okay, cool. So, I mean, we talked about a lot of stuff, and like I said, this is we did a bit of a deep dive into mechanical tension, metabolic stress, and these are huge and really fascinating topics. But let's quickly run over then. I mean, unless there's anything else that you think is worth talking about on this study, let's do a little bit of a too long didn't read TLDR recap. What are your kind of takeaways on this study? And maybe then you can place it within the bigger literature. What should people know about this? And what should they know from the overarching research we have on, your cluster methods.
Yeah, sure. So I think the one thing which I was going to add, but then it kind of ties really well into the conclusion, is that if you look at the duration of training across the two methods, because the 3-7, they only did the 2 sets separated by the 2 minutes, they were basically done in like 6 minutes compared to like the 8x6, where they did 8 sets separated by 2 minutes each. Like you're there for 20 odd minutes. So it's a really time efficient way to train, which is kind of like, yeah, like that's great. Like time efficiency is like a really big factor for programming, because some people are really time poor. Some people don't want to spend time in gyms. So knowing that you can get like good results, and like in this study, like it got far superior results from an intervention, like an exercise intervention, which takes far less time. Like that's really comforting to know as a coach, because if I am programming for someone who's time poor, I'm not sitting there in the back of my head going, oh no, like I'm not writing the best program for this client because they don't have time. I know that like I could, as long as I've got them training hard, training with good intensities and getting their sufficient volumes in, they're probably going to be doing most of the big rocks correctly, and they're probably going to get most of the gains that they would be able to make, even if they had that extra little bit of time, which would be nice. But even if they don't, like still can get some really good results. I think that overall this method has shown that it's certainly not ineffective. Like how you utilize it in a program may vary, but it may be really good for novelty, like, and also really good for individuals who you may want to teach them what hard training feels like. You might have someone who hasn't really trained hard before. You're like, okay, I need to teach you what hard training feels like so that we can begin to understand that the requirements from an intensity perspective that we need to achieve in order to induce a large enough stimulus to gain some muscle tissue. I probably wouldn't use it like year round. I don't think it's something that you use over and over and over. I do like it more so from that novelty perspective. And I probably would keep it more so to the isolation movements, although I dare say you could still find a use for them with the compounds.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think something like, for instance, like a hack squat would be a good example of something where this may potentially come into play to get some of those higher reps in without it being boring or unachievable, basically. Like I said, maybe not your squats, maybe not your deadlifts, but yeah, awesome. So just to recap, and we kind of talked about this a little bit before, and this was kind of our kind of takeaways from this kind of run as follow, that basically, your rest and your cluster pull methods can absolutely be a valid way of creating growth. But a really important takeaway is that just because it's a valid way of creating hypertrophy doesn't mean it's better, right? We do still have that gold standard of straight sets. If time allows, you're probably better off still doing straight sets. But if you do want a bit of novelty, or you want to push yourself a little bit more, or you're short on time, by all means, some of these methods can be completely valid and good ways of creating a result. A downside to this is, or not a downside, but something worth still considering, is that, like I said, we still want to keep that emphasis on mechanical tension-based training, right? Just because you can do this method and get a good pump and get a burn in the muscle doesn't necessarily mean that you want to be doing that on every set. The drop sets, the run the rack drop sets, myo sets, things like that, while they can, absolutely produce a result, nothing's going to really create hypertrophy like just getting in and doing some hard sets, letting yourself recover, and repeating that, until you're done, basically.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. I think that, one of the only other things that I've just remembered to talk about is that with the 3-7, because it is a method, it does seem hard to overload, especially on the biceps. Like let's say you do 3-7 for a few weeks, and all of a sudden it's getting a little bit easier because you're getting a little bit stronger. It's like, well, where do you go from there? It's like jumping up 1 kilo on the dumbbell might be too big an overload. And like, unless you've got like access to micro plates to kind of add to your dumbbells, you may have to kind of go a little bit off program and start doing a 4-8 method in order to get a few more reps in, so that you can still satisfy those intensity thresholds. So yeah, just another kind of point to reiterate, like it is a method, but like it may be a little bit difficult to implement practically, especially for like longer stretches of time.
I think a good kind of take home with that, and I think a good take home with this, and something you might agree with, is also that anytime a method like this comes along, no matter how valid it is and where it does have its place, I don't think you can go wrong using it on the back half of your workout or on your accessories. Right, as long as you're still training hard, it will still get a result. If it's fun, awesome. But I know I personally would prefer not to put all my eggs in the new fad basket, right? The bread and butter should be 90% of your workout. Focus on training hard, getting good at training hard. And then these kinds of methods, if you want to throw them in at the end, have a bit of a play with them. It's very rarely going to hurt your results as long as you're still training hard.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And most of us probably train with a frequency of more than 1 times per week per muscle group. So if you've got arms multiple times per week, hey, it's like you might have that third arms day. Like that might be the day where you get to play around with a few new tricks and toys.
100%. Look, I mean, well, like I said, once gym's open, I am definitely going to be having a play with this. It'll be a good way to get a bit of a pump on and start to build that God complex back now that all my muscles wasted away while I've been in lockdown. But look, I'm looking forward to giving it a crack, and we might do a little recap on this later on down the track and see if our opinions have changed. But in the meantime, Aaron, any parting words, or where can people find you?
Yeah, so just find me on social media at aaron.hoey, or you can check out JPS Health and Fitness, and I'm pretty active on most of their social media and most of their education resources.
Aaron is also the meme king, and I've been reposting, and everyone on social media has been reposting some of his recent efforts, so you can find him there. As always, I'm Coach Cadd. You can find me pretty much everywhere on social media under Coach Cadd. These days, I'm leaning pretty heavily into the YouTube, so I definitely recommend checking that out. But Aaron, thank you. It's been a blast. I will see you at some time, same place for a next adventure.
Absolutely, Braden. Can't wait.
And that's everything for today on this episode of the Too Long Didn't Read Fitness podcast. If you can take a second to like, subscribe, leave a comment, share, whatever it is, it all goes a long way to help us boost our little ranking within the algorithm. Thank you to everyone that's left reviews and comments already. It goes a long way. And if you would like to support us a little bit further, you can go through the link on my Instagram or the link in the description, and you can actually buy us a coffee. We aim to put out as much high quality content as we can on as many different free forms of social media as possible. So if you've got some value out of this and you would like to give back in some way, consider pay as much as you think the episode is worth. You can do that through the Buy Me a Coffee link, which will be available somewhere in the description box. If not, that's absolutely fine too. You can help us out other ways by sharing, doing whatever you can, just tell your friends about it, and hopefully they can get some value out of this too. Or if you've got any kind of feedback or thoughts or any topics you'd like us to cover, you can send me or Aaron a message over on Instagram. We look forward to seeing you on the next episode and hope you're great. Chat soon.